Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving way past the fireworks and the hot dogs to explore the true history, some truly bizarre traditions, and the profound legacy of America's Independence Day. You know, digging into this source material was actually incredibly surprising because there's just so much more to the 4th of July than we typically realize. Let's get right into it.
Here's how we're going to break it down today. First, the July 2nd surprise, then a history in feasts, followed by quirky traditions, symbols of the nation, and finally, a more perfect union.
So, Part 1. The July 2nd surprise, a historical mix-up.
We absolutely have to start by debunking the very date we celebrate. Because get this, Founding Father John Adams actually thought the big day was July 2nd. The push for independence didn't just happen overnight. It started on June 7, 1776, when Virginia delegate Richard Henry Lee introduced a resolution stating the United Colonies ought to be free and independent states. Then, the Continental Congress actually took the official vote to sever ties with Britain on July 2nd. But the final wording of the Declaration of Independence, that famous document drafted by Thomas Jefferson and his committee, well, that wasn't officially ratified and distributed until July 4th.
It's kind of fascinating just how absolutely certain Adams was that July 2nd was going to be the great anniversary festival. He even wrote a letter to his wife Abigail, predicting that the 2nd of July would be celebrated by succeeding generations with, quote, pomp and parade, with shows, games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations. I mean, he hit the nail on the head regarding how we celebrate for sure, but history, and, well, the date stamped on the final published document, ultimately proved him wrong on the actual day.
And hey, speaking of dates, we have to talk about the number 50. In what is literally one of the most astonishing historical coincidences ever, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, two of the main architects of American independence, died on the exact same day. And that day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years to the day after the birth of the United States. No way, right? Just incredible.
All right, moving right along to Section 2. A History in Feasts, Evolving July 4th Menus.
So if we look at how our holiday menus have evolved over time, those early celebrations looked very, very different from the backyard cookouts we know today. When John and Abigail Adams celebrated, they sat down to a pretty practical New England meal, poached salmon, green peas, unpeeled potatoes, and they finished it all off with a molasses-sweetened apple pan-dowdy. But wow, fast forward to the 19th century and the contrast is just wild. Politicians started hosting these massive public rallies to feed thousands of voters at once. There's this one account from New York in 1837 that described Broadway as being lined with literally 6 miles of roast pig stalls. 6 miles! Meanwhile, down south, politicians were hosting enormous gatherings, slow-cooking whole hogs over hickory coals. The crucial takeaway here is that our founders actually had incredibly diverse personal tastes, and those tastes really shaped American food. Take George Washington. He loved rustic hoe cakes, which are basically cornmeal patties fried in lard, and he'd wash them down with rye whiskey from his own distillery. Then you have Thomas Jefferson. He was kind of America's first real foodie. He actually brought macaroni and cheese and French fries to his 1801 July 4th celebration. He even recorded the first American recipe for ice cream. And then there's Benjamin Franklin, who famously championed local snapping turtle soup. Even crazier, he developed a recipe for tofu way back in 1770 to promote protein alternatives.
Which naturally brings us to the quirky birth of the modern hot dog. Now, you might be wondering, was the hot dog always around? Actually, no. It wasn't a holiday fixture until the late 19th century. It all started in the 1860s, when German immigrants introduced frankfurters to the U.S. By the 1870s, they were being sold from New York dog wagons. And yeah, that name came from dark jokes that the sausages were actually made of dachshund meat. But the real game changer happened in 1871. A guy named Charles Feltman started selling them tucked inside milk rolls at his Coney Island stand, and he moved over 3,600 of them in his very first year. By 1893, they become a total ballpark staple, completely cementing their place in American culture.
Okay, moving to Section 3. Quirky Traditions, Unique Local Celebrations.
So, stepping away from the backyard barbecue for a second, communities all across America have developed some incredibly unique ways to celebrate. The Smithsonian Magazine recently put out a list highlighting 10 wonderfully unusual 4th of July traditions that celebrate America like no other. And it just goes to show that patriotism really does take many, many forms across the country.
It's just a fascinating spectrum of local pride. For example, in Hannibal, Missouri, they host a literal Tom Sawyer-inspired fence painting contest. Up in Vermont, teams of 3 actually sprint down a 500-foot stretch, racing custom-built, fully functional outhouses on wheels. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Over in Bend, Oregon, they've been doing this massive pet parade since 1924. Then you've got Gatlinburg, Tennessee, aiming to be first by kicking off their parade at exactly 12:01 a.m. on July 4th. And out in Hawaii, they have this really beautiful tradition of releasing microchipped green sea turtles right back into the Pacific Ocean.
Now, check out this contrast in extremes. Down in Key West, Florida, competitors dive face first into 9-inch key lime pies with their hands tied behind their backs. The record, by the way, is a staggering 40.57 seconds. That's just crazy. Meanwhile, out west, in the living ghost town of Oatman, Arizona, they just embrace the sweltering heat. They literally hold an egg-frying contest on the sidewalk. People use mirrors and magnifying glasses to harness the solar heat, getting the cooking surface up to a glistering 158 degrees, just to see who can fry an egg the fastest.
All right, Section 4, Symbols of the Nation, Icons of Independence.
Before we hit our final, more philosophical note for today, let's take a quick look at the official symbols. We all instantly associate the 4th with fireworks, right? Symbolizing the rocket's red glare. Well, those were actually introduced during the very first anniversary celebration way back in 1777. But here's the surprising part. It took almost an entire century for Independence Day to be recognized as an official federal holiday. That didn't actually happen until 1870.
And that brings us to our final part. Section 5, A More Perfect Union, The Enduring Legacy.
For this last section, we're going to shift tones just a bit. We're looking at a deeply reflective essay from the Minneapolis Times that discusses the heavy moral weight of the Declaration of Independence. The author makes the case that when Thomas Jefferson wrote those famous words, "All men are created equal," he definitely wasn't describing the actual reality of the country at the time. Instead, the essay argues, he was setting a powerful, unfulfilled standard, a standard that would basically challenge the nation permanently to live up to its own creed.
The essay points out a really stark contradiction here. The reality of 1776 was, as the source describes it, a moral catastrophe marked by the systemic exclusion of enslaved people, women, and indigenous populations. However, the Minneapolis Times piece emphasizes that the Declaration simultaneously provided an enduring standard. It actually gave those exact marginalized groups a powerful moral vocabulary. It became the very framework they later used to demand their rights and fight for equality.
Because of this standard, the Minneapolis Times notes that the Declaration of Independence has actually never belonged only to the founders. In fact, it belongs most urgently to reformers. Think about it. Frederick Douglass used its core principles to expose the hypocrisy of slavery. Abraham Lincoln used it to anchor the nation to its central proposition during the Civil War. And suffragists demanded those very claims of equality be applied to women. They all used this foundational document as a powerful tool to push America forward toward a quote-unquote more perfect union.
We're going to end this explainer with a pretty provocative question straight from that Minneapolis Times piece. The essay concludes by arguing that the founders gave us words that still matter immensely, but they didn't give us a completed country. The idea is that self-government has to be actively renewed by every single generation. So the question remains, as this original promise continues to call the nation forward, even after 250 years, are we still willing to answer? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the source material. Keep asking questions, and as always, keep learning.